services today, and we hope that you will worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, because this is what the Lord wants us to do. That is to worship Him in spirit and in truth. And with that said, I want us to talk this morning about worshiping God. Does God accept your worship? That's the question that I want you to think about this morning. Does God accept your worship? Now, there are some people who say it doesn't matter how we worship God. But does the Bible really teach that? Can I really worship God any way that I want to, and then God is still going to be pleased with my worship? And if we know anything about the Bible at all, we know that that is simply not true. God has never been acceptable or accepted people worship that did not worship Him in the way that He has commanded them to do. So to make the statement that it doesn't matter how we worship is simply not true. It does matter to God how we worship Him. And if we are not worshiping Him in the way that He has set forth in His Word, then our worship is not acceptable to Him. Now let's look at some worship that we find in the Bible. When we look at Acts chapter 17 and verse 22, there we find ignorant worship. Paul, in speaking to the Athenians, said, "Ye men of Athens," notice, "ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotion, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, whom therefore you ignorantly," notice, "you ignorantly worship Him, declare I unto you." That's found in Acts chapter 17, verses 22 and 23. And so here is some people in Paul's days that was worshiping God, excuse me, but they was doing it ignorantly. And so if they was worshiping God ignorantly back then, don't you think that we can also still worship the God ignorantly today? Those people were worshiping all kinds of God, and they didn't want to leave any God out whatsoever. So what did they do? Just in case they might have missed one, they put a sign that says, "To an unknown God." That way they'll make sure that they got them all. But the point is this: they was worshiping God, they was serving God, but they was doing it ignorantly. We can only worship and serve God if we do it according to His will. But these people were ignorantly worshiping God then, and I believe if we're not careful, we can also ignorantly be worshiping God today. But not only does the Bible speak of ignorant worship, the Bible also speaks of vain worship. In Matthew chapter 15, verses 7 through 9, Jesus said to some righteous people, religious people if you will, at least they was righteous in their own mind, but they was not righteous in God's sight, of the first century, and He said, "Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying," notice, "This people draw nigh unto me with their mouth, and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." Notice, their hearts is far from me. "But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So here's a group of people that was worshiping God, but they was doing it in vain. Well, why is it that their worship was in vain? Well, it tells us because, first of all, their hearts were not in it, and also they were teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. And so it can be clearly seen here from this passage that worship in vain, my friend, is when people teach doctrines in the commandments of men. So that says within itself, we cannot just worship God any way that we want to. We cannot worship God doing those things that pleases us and have no consideration for what God has said. And I'm afraid that there are so many today that falls into that category. They are teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Now, the question that we asked at the beginning was, does God accept your worship? Now you think about the things that you do in your worship service. Are those the things that God have commanded for you to do? And let's face it, people are doing, people are saying, and people are practicing a lot of things in worship today that they have no authority for. And if we have no authority to practice those things, then don't you think that our worship is in vain as well? What do you practice in your worship service? Do you practice those things that you find in the Bible, such as singing? The Bible very clearly teaches us that we are to sing praise unto God. Is that what you do? The Bible teaches us that the early disciples on the first day of the week, when they came together to worship God, that they break bread, they partook of the Lord's Supper. Do you do that in your worship service today? We also have where God teaches us in His Word very clearly that we are to pray. And we have an example where the early disciples gave on the first day of the week. Now, and there was preaching as well. Now, do you practice those things in your worship service today? If not, then you need to. Because singing and praying and preaching and partaking of the Lord's Supper, those are things that God has commanded us to do in His Word. And all this other stuff as feet washing and you name it, you cannot find those things commanded by God to do in worship. So any worship that is not according to the commandments of God is vain worship. And when you look even in the Old Testament, you can see when people did not worship God as He directed, many times they were killed. For an example, like when those boys, Nadab and Abihu, when they offer up a strange fire unto God, God killed those boys on the spot. Why? Because they did not use the fire that God instructed for them to use. And so my point is this, and I hope I can drive it home very clearly. Worshiping God according to His will is what pleases Him. And the only thing that we need to do in our worship service is to do what God commanded us to do. And if He has not commanded us to do certain things, then we ought not to do those things. But it is vain worship. And you see, not only does the Bible speaks of vain worship and ignorant worship, but in Colossians chapter 2 verses 18 to 23, There Paul mentions some things, and he talks about will worship. Notice, which things have indeed a show of wisdom in will, worship and humility, and neglecting of the body, not in any honor of the satisfying of the flesh. Will worship is worship directed by and is after one's own will. Oh, we can see that, can't we? Will worship. This, in other words, this is what I want to do. I want to worship God this way, and I'm going to worship God this way. And there are many today that do that. But is it acceptable into God's sight? Well, I like doing this, and I like doing that. Fine and dandy. But is that what God said for us to do? And if not, whether we like it or not, we ought to leave it alone and just simply worship and serve God in the way that He has directed us to do. And the last one that I want to mention is true worship. The Bible teaches in John chapter 4 verses 23 through 24 that we are to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, because this is the way that God seeketh that we are to worship Him. So, does God accept your worship? If it's not in spirit and in truth, then I'm afraid it's not acceptable in God's sight. I see that my time is gone, and I appreciate you for yours. Until next time, we bid you a pleasant good day.
Let us break bread together. All